selling something ever since I was a kid because he never had any money. My father was a salesman. He had no life insurance. And he said, you've got to invent something, patent something to become wealthy and to make a good income. You've got to have some sort of a great career. That's how it all started. And I started knocking on doors selling pots and pans and rubber sponges and stuff. And I was a king of pots and pans in Australia as a teenager. I could sell more pots and pans than you'd ever seen. And I made plenty of money out of doing that, more money than the school teachers. And I bought a first block of land when I was 17, built a house on that, and I decided to become a real estate guru. And with Barb and I, our wealth's come in real estate, which if you look at the richest people in the world, their wealth is in real estate. That's where they're making it. So we thought we'd do that, and also we'll invent something, create something. So in the late 60s, when I was teaching salespeople how to sell, how to knock on doors and get a yes. And part of that was how to read somebody's behaviour when you're sitting around the lounge room floor presenting the product or the service, how you could tell by their movement or behaviour what their intentions might be, what they might do next. Now the word body language hadn't even invented at that point. That was something that came later in the 70s. And when I'd run classes on how to sell and negotiate, including how to read people, the bit on how to read people was the most popular. People were absolutely amazed. Now, remembering the late 60s, salesmen were just about all men. You didn't see any women. And these guys were absolutely taken by this whole thing. But what I did discover, that the sessions where they'd bring their wives, girlfriends and their women along, which they did regularly, the women would say, yeah, that's right, that's how it works. So the women I discovered early seemed to know about this. They didn't know that they knew about it, but they knew about it. But for guys, it was a brand new thing. I didn't have a clue. We don't have the same ability to read non-verbal signals as our female counterparts, and our brain scan shows that pretty clearly. And so that session on reading people became a standalone session on its own, which was incredibly popular. And then in the early 70s, I thought I could put this into a book. And I remember saying, if I could sell 10,000 copies of this book and make $6 a book, it's like $60,000. I mean, that's worth more than my father's home. 4 of my father's homes, come to think of it. So in 1976, I put pen to paper and I wrote a book which I called The Secret Language of Your Customer's Body. There were too many words on the page, to fit the size of the book, so we cut it down, we came up with body language. That's how the word was created, because there wasn't enough space to put the full title. So the full title became Body Language, subtitle, How to Read Others' Thoughts by Their Gestures. And that went number 1 in Australia. It went number 1 worldwide for 3 years. It just sat there and didn't move. And it got turned into movies, and then I started travelling the world doing interviews on it. It was just great. So the next 4 books after that all hit number 1 on the strength of the first book. And we've had 11 number 1s in a row now, which is an interesting point. Someone said the other day, how do you write number 1s? Well, you decide. And it's just as hard or easy to write a number 1 bestseller as it is to write a bestseller, as it is to write just a book. So if you set out deciding to write, we decided we are only going to write number 1 bestsellers. Because we ran into some financial difficulties in the 90s and lost everything, houses, cars, boats, planes, the whole lot. We've down renting a little five-row house, which was a bit devastating. But we decided we'd write number 1 books, because number 1 books sell by the millions, so we needed that to be able to recover. And when you decide to do something like that, as soon as you decide to write, I'm only going to write a bestseller, I'm only going to write number 1, then your brain, the RAS, which is the title of our last book, start searching for how you do it. And so suddenly all these bestseller lists would appear, and I could see what titles people were paying money for. So now I'd know what people would pay money for, what subjects I wanted. And the first book that came out of that technique was Why Men Don't Listen, Women Can't Read Maps. It sold 13 million copies, and then the 3 books after that sold another 6 or 7 million. So that's how it happened. It happened by, it evolved from a training session that was popular into a session that worked on its own, which we call The Language of the Customer's Body, which became the title of the book, which became Body Language. We're now 45 years later, and in some countries, Body Language, that book, we now call it the definitive book of body language, been upgraded. It's still number 1 in other countries in the world. It just goes on and on, which is pretty amazing, because most books will have a lifespan of maybe 1 to 2 years if you're lucky. Our books have a lifespan average of 10 to 12 years, but we intentionally write that way. We write our books so that when you're reading it, you don't really know where it was written or when it was written. And anybody reading our books, whether they're in Iceland or Africa, or whether they're in Indonesia, Philippines, or France or Germany, they think it was written by a local. That's the thing we get a lot, that people say, oh, you must be local because you know how we think. Well, most men and women think pretty much the same basics everywhere. We're just different in the language we speak and how we perceive the world. That's been the only difference. The Barb also came from Housing Commission in Queensland, so we both had a good start. So when we lost all our money and went back to zero, in fact, we went past zero, we were millions of dollars in debt, which we had to pay back. Going back to zero wasn't that big a deal because we started from zero. And if you start from zero, you know what it's like.